Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, which for the sake of brevity I'll be referring to as Sekiro from here on out, was released in 2019 by From Software, the creators of Demon Souls, the Dark Souls series, and Bloodborne. Since the Souls series was beginning to stagnate and become formulaic, in a way, Sekiro is a nice departure. There's no multiplayer, meaning there's no co-op, covenants, or invasions. There's a definite main protagonist that is his own character. The setting and story are completely different, stealth is emphasized as a gameplay mechanic, and the combat system has enough differences to feel unique compared to the previous FromSoft games. Enough has been changed to feel like a new adventure, but there's a lot here that either doesn't work as well as it could have, doesn't live up to what the previous games managed to accomplish, or feels needlessly carried over from the previous FromSoft games. In some ways, Sekiro hits the mark, but in others, it's extremely disappointing, so much so that it doesn't leave me eager to come back to it anytime soon. In this video, I'll be discussing Sekiro in depth, so spoilers for the entire game will follow. Enough has been said about the interconnected world design of the original Dark Souls, but it's now essentially clear that it was just a happy accident. Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3 all have fast traveling between checkpoints right at the start of the game to carry players through their linear worlds, and Sekiro is the exact same way. From the very beginning straight to the very end, you'll be constantly warping all over the map. While I think Sekiro, in a few areas, does take advantage of its verticality, it doesn't use it to connect the world together as much as it could have. I'm not discounting how much the added verticality aids in exploration, however, because it definitely does. But the levels mostly feel like Dark Souls 2 or 3, where you start a new area, you finish it, then the next area begins. Maybe I just haven't explored the world enough, but as far as I can tell, every level is only connected to the area right before it and the area right after it, except for a select few. You can use the Shinobi shortcut from Ashina Castle to the dilapidated temple. Ashina Castle itself leads to the Abandoned Dungeon, Ashina Outskirts, and the Sunken Valley. The Abandoned Dungeon gives access to the Senpo Temple and Ashina Depths locations, and the Shinobi shortcut from Ashina Outskirts after the Headless mini-boss leads into the Senpo Temple near the Demon Bell. Unfortunately, that last one doesn't even work until much later on in the game. If you decide to risk defeating or running past the Headless early on, you only get access to the Demon Bell. There's an arbitrary blocked door, because of course there is, which means you can't access the Senpo Temple until later on. This seems especially misguided, as this section of the game can already be accessed early by going through the Abandoned Dungeon right after the Flaming Bullfight. It might not sound so bad on the surface. FromSoft probably didn't want players going through this area backwards, but if you remember, Dark Souls 1 let players enter Blighttown's back door right at the start of the game with the Master Key. This blocked door near the Demon Bell is disheartening, especially since it mostly restricts returning players. Starting out brand new, I doubt most people would dive headfirst into this mini-boss fight, especially given that there's a warning sign saying not to, it's a hard-to-reach location, and it isn't on the obvious main path. All this does is force returning players to fight Gyobu Oniwa and the Flaming Bull. If we remove the Shinobi shortcuts in Ashina Castle and Ashina Outskirts, as well as the Secret Walk the Plank section in Senpo Mountains, that leaves us with only 2 locations that connect to more than one area. Hirata Estate is completely separate from the rest of the world map that the player needs to warp to. After jumping down the bottomless hole, it's a straight shot to the Corrupted Monk fight, and the Sunken Valley, Gun Fort, and Senpo Temple sections bottleneck the player in similar ways. This is not to say these areas aren't fun to explore. On a moment-to-moment basis, the level design itself is well considered. There's quite a few secret areas and side sections to see, and for the most part, it doesn't feel like you're linearly walking from point A to B. It's only disappointing after you take a step back and see how everything connects together. Even if you don't see it straight away, you'll feel it by how often you'll warp from checkpoint to checkpoint throughout the game. On that topic, something that bugged me even more was how clumped together many of the checkpoint statues were. Bloodborne had this issue in a couple of areas, and Dark Souls 3 was prolific for it, but Sekiro puts them both to shame. At the top of Ashina Castle, before the Genichiro boss fight, you have a checkpoint. You get a checkpoint statue in the boss arena itself, and then there's a checkpoint right after you defeat Genichiro. If you want to stretch it even further, going through the secret passageway brings you back to the hub area, which also has one. Since a sculpture idol shows up every time you defeat a main boss, I'm assuming this was solely put in there so the player can fight them repeatedly. You can use the idols to fight previous boss fights in isolation, in addition to a boss rush of sorts, but after the boss is defeated, the fog remains, trapping you inside, thus warping out is your only method of leaving. It's an awfully strange concession to make considering you can access the boss rushes and the memories at any of the sculptor idols. It muddies up the fast travel menu, and since the idols are so close together, there's really no meaningful difference between a lot of them. The double ape fight has one in its arena, 2 close together before the fight, and 1 right afterwards. The guardian ape fight spawns an idol after you defeat him, even though there's already a checkpoint right on top of the ledge not 5 seconds away. The true monk is the same way, where it spawns an idol seconds away from the previous one. The corrupted monk is similar, but since the player will need to come back to the wedding door later on, it's not quite as bad. Even ignoring the boss's added checkpoints, there's still examples where it gets excessive. In the opening area, you can essentially run to 3 within the span of a couple of seconds. Ashina Outskirts has so many that it takes up an entire column of sculptor idols on the warping menu. I think this in particular has a lot to do with an issue with the healing items in the early game, but I'll talk about that later on. Even ignoring how much more tedious and confusing this many checkpoints makes the act of choosing which location to warp to is, it has a knock-on effect that diminishes the tension felt when exploring a new area. You're seemingly always close to a nearby checkpoint, and with how easily you can run by enemies with a faster run speed and increased maneuverability, this makes even less sense than in the previous FromSoft games. You can't even use the excuse that they were trying to make sure players didn't waste time running through already explored and empty areas on their way to a previous idol, since the player has a permanent warping item with them at all times, which can warp them to the last checkpoint rested at, or the hub area. So even though the second idol in the poison pond is most likely there so the player can use it to warp out after doing the giant serpent heist, it still didn't need to exist, since the player always has that warping item. It's baffling how in some ways with Sekiro, they let players die repeatedly without lending a helping hand, while in other ways they baby the player, assuming they are so impatient they couldn't be bothered to open up their inventory to use a key item, or take the time to walk back a few more steps. Personally, I would have had no problem starting at the hub area checkpoint, and being forced to make it through the entire way to at least the stairway checkpoint. Well, I would have if the game didn't start you with only 1 use of your healing flask. That's something that seems to exacerbate a lot of the issues in the early game, but like I said, I'll talk about that later on. While we're on that topic, given the method the player will most likely figure out something is amiss, the surprise that happens later on in the game was pretty anticlimactic. If you have any interest in avoiding spoilers, this is your last warning. After a certain point in the game, the castle the player has become familiar with and explored already gets taken over. New enemies are introduced, which are even intermixed with previous ones. This causes the area to not only become more dangerous, but also more interesting on a moment-to-moment level. This is the only time, other than using the puppeteer technique, where you can pit enemy units against each other. It's truly a great subversion, but it has one glaring flaw. You're likely to discover something is wrong when you aren't able to warp to the castle. The castle is the centerpiece to the entire map. If the world had been better connected to encourage locomotion via walking, running, and grappling between previously explored areas instead of fast traveling, this surprise would have been much more engaging. Imagine traveling a great distance to retrieve the Resurrection MacGuffin, only on your return trip do you see the castle has been taken over. The game would let you experience the twist through gameplay, but how it is now, the game makes you experience it through a menu. It's a missed opportunity if you ask me, and the fact that it happens twice is kind of absurd. No matter how much goodwill that first warp menu surprise may have instilled into players who are less cynical than me, seeing it happen the second time couldn't have been as impactful. Something that FromSoft should be commended for is the implementation of swimming. Regardless if you were fine with the outcome or not, dropping dead the moment you entered a water source in the previous games was obviously silly looking. I quite like the moxie of FromSoft to not just shy away from water sources the player might walk into, but instead create swimming mechanics, allow them to swing their sword in the water, dash, and even eventually dive underwater. The combat underwater isn't anything amazing, but it's enough to kill a few fish or defeat a headless if you wanted to. Generally, water levels in most games are a boring slog, but the dash ability makes them all a breeze. They also thankfully didn't restrict the player's time underwater with the breath meter or anything. You can stay underwater indefinitely. Initially, I didn't think much of the new diving ability, but when I saw how much it added to finding secrets and exploring, finding a pool of water I hadn't dove into got exciting. In that regard, it's pretty clever how many areas take on a new light with this ability acquired. It isn't obvious in the slightest that you'd have the power to explore beneath the surface at some point. A good way to understand my thoughts on this is to compare it to a Metroid-style game. When you see a grappling point randomly or notice a crack in a tunnel or a floor, You know to remember that area for later on when you get a specific power-up. There's nothing like that with the water, and all of the areas that are only accessible via underwater diving don't immediately give the impression that diving would be the solution. The game eventually plays a trick on players who have become accustomed to jumping into every pool of water they find. The makeshift lake in Fountainhead Palace looks like it would be the safer route through this area, but there's a faraway enemy that shoots out lightning, all but guaranteeing a player death. I thought I was being clever by swimming to the few bits of land, then jumping to parry the lightning, thus avoiding damage. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to grapple up to the deck like I planned, which meant I had to go around. There's a flooded cave where a giant carp hangs out that leads to the next checkpoint. This stealth section plays out much the same as the snake, which I'll talk about later on. Besides swimming, there's of course the new grappling hook. It does a nice job of vertically opening up level design. Falling down a valley would normally lead to certain death, but in Sekiro it may have a few grapple points that you can use to access secret areas. I have 3 issues with the grappling system. First off, it feels arbitrary and restrictive which tree branches, rooftop corners, and hooks you're allowed to grapple. You already saw the issue when I was in Fountainhead Palace trying to get out of the water, but a similar moment happened in Mibu Village trying to get behind this house. Secondly, when a grappling point is nearby but currently unreachable, it will have a grayed out circle on it, opposed to the green marker indicating you can grapple it from your position. Since many require jumping towards them to latch onto, it can be very unclear if jumping towards the tree branch or rooftop will get you close enough to grapple, or if you'll end up coming up short and falling down. There's a missing link in the visual language for the grappling system that leads to it not always being a free-flowing experience, but trial and error at times. My last problem is how easily abusable it is when in tight combat scenarios, or when wanting to avoid enemies entirely. It might bring you closer to the mindset of being a ninja, nimbly maneuvering around the landscape, engaging with hostiles on your terms, but it can lead to a lot of skipped enemy encounters. This might be more of an issue with the stealth system in general, but there's less of a reason to remain undetected when you're able to freely grapple and run past everybody. Being able to skip groups of enemies would feel better if it meant I had to stealthily cross through an area, not just hold the run button and grapple onto rooftops. With such an emphasis on the stealth mechanics, you'd think it would have been handled a bit better. You can crouch, hide in grass, go under crevices of houses, eavesdrop to hear conversations, and surprise enemies with an instant death blow on them. The first minor downside with giving stealth more of a spotlight are the arrows that show up above enemies' heads, and even around Wolf if the enemy is out of view. This is something you'd see in lesser games, a marker slapped onto the screen, unrelated to anything tangible in the world itself. It provides information on whether you're close to being caught or not, and whether the enemy knows where you are or just knows you're nearby. With how linear most pathways are, it shouldn't be that tall of an order for players to pay attention to the enemies themselves. I get they were probably trying to work around the verticality of Wolf's movement, but this also seems necessary with how often the enemies blend in with their environments. Realistic graphics and detailed textures have their downsides when it comes to visual clarity, especially for areas with lots of foliage. For stealth to work well, it should always be clear where the enemies are. It's unfortunate that the arrows needed to exist, but I can understand it to an extent given how detailed and monochromatic most environments are. If we accept the arrows as a stand-in for better visual clarity for enemies and lookouts, being able to see them through walls, water, and floors feels very out of place. Maybe that's something they should have worked on, not having it show up when the enemy is out of view. How quickly Wolf can be detected never seemed consistent throughout my playthroughs. I imagine it was intentional to have the distance the enemy can detect Wolf be wildly different depending on the enemy type, such as the Sunken Valley gun-wielding sentries that can spot you from very far away, compared to the regular swordsmen who bumble around like they have mud in their eyes. Even still, I could seemingly have a combat encounter with someone next to their ally, and depending on the exact angle they were facing, they might not even notice. This could have something to do with the latent skills you can acquire that essentially make Wolf harder to detect. For me, it just made it less clear when enemies would notice me or not. Regardless of how high you get that stealth level, enemies shouldn't be struggling to spot you when you're standing out in the open in broad daylight. The extremely loud death blow sound that plays every time you get a stealth kill seems really unnecessary. That sound is only being played for the player's benefit, not the character's, so I'd rather they just not even include it. There's only 2 stealth-related moments that really stood out to me. There's a gun fort the player is trying to get into, but there are sentry enemies on the wall that spot Wolf from very far away. Even getting closer requires sprinting across a bridge as all of them fire at you. Once you make it over there, you can take it slower, killing one at a time, This area has firecracker sound alarms. Not only did it scare the shit out of me when it happened the first time, it really made this area and these enemies feel unique. It gave me an appreciation for their craftiness, and it makes sense that they would have gunpowder or firecrackers, as they're armed with guns and cannons as it is, protecting a gun fort. The other moment that's hard to forget is the gigantic serpent. The sheer size of it is enough to leave you in awe. It's absolutely massive. I have a fascination with gigantic serpents, so this definitely appealed to me initially. The gameplay surrounding the snake, however, is pretty mundane. The player is expected to bide their time, wait for when the snake isn't looking, and run to the next hidden location for safety. This feels like the Dragon God from Demon Souls, but more refined, so I'd have to assume this is Miyazaki attempting to rectify a previous failure. It does work better than the Dragon God, but we'd have to admit that's a pretty low bar. I don't love that if the snake sees you, it's essentially an instant failure. However, there's really not much you can do to penalize players in stealth games, so I can understand it to an extent. The ending to this section is genuinely great, as stabbing him in the eye creates a surprising amount of chaos. Besides that, the most I can say about this section is it's really one of the only times the game takes its stealth seriously. I've been going back and forth in my head on whether the added stealth elements were a success or not. If it was included for the sake of it, something to fill in the obvious gaps of the previous games, then it's tempting to say that it was a worthwhile inclusion. Since the previous FromSoft games allowed players to walk by enemies undetected and backstab them from behind anyway, stealth kind of existed on accident. Now it exists by design. The players who do like it can crouch, slide, hide, and take out enemies in isolation without always having to kite them away from a bigger group. However, if stealth was meant to be what the player should be focusing on between mini-boss and boss battles, I'd say it was a failure. There aren't any stakes. You can always sprint away or use your grappling hook to flee to safety. When you hide from the enemies for a while, they of course completely forget they ever saw you, so you can get the drop on them like before. The worst part about it is you can easily ignore stealth entirely and run right by enemies without a care in the world. The enemies rarely have a chance to stop the player or keep up with them in any way, but even when they try, once the player makes it to the next checkpoint idle, they can have a rest and that's that. They've successfully skipped a large group of enemies without any combat or stealth. You can essentially run past everything and get straight to the bosses and mini-bosses, and then the game becomes a much more clunky type of boss rush. If half the game was meant to be stealth, it's incredibly odd that outside of the serpent and carp sections, you're never forced to engage with it. This seems like a question with an obvious answer. Stealth is another avenue for the player, something that gives them more choices, meaning it's a net positive. Giving players more freedom to tackle challenges presented to them in their own way is generally a good thing. The shinobi tools are an excellent example of that. There's enough here to keep players customizing and experimenting with loadouts to see what works for them for quite a while. And on the flip side, for someone like me who didn't care about them at all, I was able to ignore all of them for my 2 playthroughs. Players having more options can be a good thing, but the problem with Sekiro is the dichotomy between the gameplay while exploring around freely and the gameplay while in boss fights. No matter what type of gameplay style the player has chosen for themselves, no matter how they've upgraded their skills, the boss fights will always ask them to test their combat prowess in a fast-paced and brutal manner. There's no way to run past them, and there's no way to use stealth. The only way to get to the ending of the game is by defeating these bosses, and in some cases the mini-bosses. This isn't a problem in and of itself. Nearly every action game in existence, including the previous FromSoft games, have mandatory boss fights. However, when you compare Sekiro to Dark Souls, it becomes pretty obvious. Stealth wasn't a viable gameplay style, the bosses themselves were far more varied, often having weaknesses and strengths depending on the character build the player chose. The world design was much more open, allowing players to tackle harder bosses later on after leveling up, and all of the gameplay between boss fights consisted of players being tested on the same sorts of mechanics. Simply making your way through the Undead Burg as a knight blocking attacks with a shield, or as a spell user dodging attacks by rolling, will teach the core mechanics of the game that the Taurus Demon will test you on. Besides one specific mini-boss encounter, Ashina Outskirts has nothing that will prepare players for Gyobu Oniwa. Since the player has such a low health pool and limited healing, they're most likely going to be taking out as many enemies as they can with stealth, then finishing off the rest by pressing the attack button 2 or 3 times to break the enemy's posture and deal a killing blow. Even if they didn't use stealth, fighting clumps of enemies at once doesn't mesh with the core mechanics of Sekiro at all, and it still doesn't teach players how to constantly be parrying and blocking attacks. This doesn't even account for players who didn't use stealth, but were able to skip enemies without making an express effort to. In the Souls games and Bloodborne, running past enemies was something lots of players did when they wanted to return to a boss fight. It's unfortunate that it was so easy to do, but that's a discussion for a different video. The point is there was a clear intention, running past the enemies to avoid combat. In Sekiro, given how vertical the terrain is, players may end up skipping a lot of enemies on accident, simply because they saw a grapple point and walked along some rooftops. With so many ways to play the in-between sections, and so few ways to play the boss battles, it shouldn't be a surprise that the infamous question got asked in the first place. You know the question I'm referring to. Is Sekiro too difficult? That's the question that has basically dominated all of the talking space around Sekiro, and for that reason, it is a shame. There's a lot more in Sekiro other than it lacking an easy mode that deserves some discussion. Even though I really don't like the frequency at which this question gets asked, there is more validity to it than most die-hard FromSoft fans will admit. The problem is, it's a flawed question. In what context? To what person? Depending on the person, this game could absolutely be too difficult, but so would many other games out there. Personally, I find strategy and puzzle games much more difficult than Sekiro, but that of course is the reason why the question itself is so worthless. I think I have a better question to ask of Sekiro while still maintaining the intention of the original. Does the game do a good enough job of acclimating players to its rules and harsh challenges? I don't think it does. The boss that finally forces players to learn the mechanics of blocking, parrying, and being aggressive will be Genichiro. For me, that was a good 6 or 7 hours into the game. 7 hours into a 20-hour playthrough. I had already gone up against a half-dozen extremely aggressive mini-bosses and 2 fully fledged boss fights. As I've mentioned before, since the in-between sections don't engage the player with similar constraints, there's never a real opportunity to teach the player the tools they'll need to get past difficult bosses before Genichiro. I do think a lot of the mini-bosses are genuinely great and could have been that missing link for teaching the player how to play the game, but they missed the mark early on. Generally, they're very close to a clump of weaker enemies that you'll need to take out every single time you want another crack at them. Since they do a tremendous amount of damage, and at this point players don't have much healing in the first place, if players aren't adjusted to blocking and parrying, they'll probably die dozens of times learning the mini-boss's moveset. Going back time and time again, having to deal with irregular enemies over and over gets extremely tedious. It isn't an environment conducive to learning, opposed to the fantastic Genichiro fight, where you can jump right back in and continue learning the moveset within moments. Asking players to get through a large chunk of the game before presenting the proper sparring partner necessary to get good at the game seems unnecessarily harsh, and could potentially scare away players who otherwise might have enjoyed the game once they got the hang of it. This is actually worse if you're a Souls series veteran. There's 5 of these FromSoft Souls-like games, and all of them encourage using invincibility frames while dodging to avoid taking damage. Anyone who has put more than 100 hours into these games will probably have that gut instinct to dodge enemy attack patterns. It's very hard to unlearn, which makes it nonsensical that some of the enemies early on can be taken down using the tried and true dodging method. A couple of them even encourage it. The designers letting players get through early enemy encounters while using Bloodborne strategies may seem innocent enough, but it can lead to extreme frustration once they're presented with challenges that they haven't been encouraged to learn how to deal with yet. I was going to present an idea of a forced tutorial section at the beginning, teaching players the parry mechanic, but it's honestly even easier than that. All the game had to do was put the centipede enemy in a room with Wolf without any healing items. Those enemies are so aggressive and consistent with their attacks, the player would have to learn how to parry before they can advance through the game. It's such a perfect enemy to learn parrying with, yet they don't show up until much later on in the game. I've of course glossed over the fact that the game does give you a sparring partner right away, and the opening tutorial section tries to teach you parrying with a few prompts, but I don't think those helped that many people. The prompts pop up right in the heat of battle, or right before it, so they're very easily skipped on accident. Even taking the time to read it won't help you much, it just teaches you the controls. The sparring partner is a good idea, but he never puts up enough of a fight to actually be useful. The only time I found him beneficial was when I was learning the Makiri counter. How limited your healing flask is early on compounds the issues I've raised already. The player is given a healing gourd that is essentially the Estus flask from Dark Souls. Like Dark Souls 2, however, you only start with one use and find resources to upgrade it as you go. You even get consumable healing gems for some reason. This is what I was saying earlier, the many checkpoint idols early on seem to be a symptom of the decision to limit the player to one heal per rest at the start. This is unnecessarily punishing, and the close-by idols don't mask the issue in the slightest. The mini-bosses in Ashina Outskirts, both the General and the Chain Ogre, in addition to the Drunkard in Hirata Estate, will be the ones the player could see even before the first boss fight. These could have been perfectly suitable learning experiences, but the limited healing means the player will be severely punished for screwing up once or twice. In my mind, there's really only 3 potential reasons the team decided to neuter the player's healing items in the early game. The first is they were intentionally making these sections difficult to kill players early and punish them harshly because FromSoft is leaning into the idea that their games are difficult. If we give them the benefit of the doubt, however, perhaps limiting the healing was their one attempt at showing players how futile dodging every attack is. Maybe if players had 5 healing flasks, they could fight the General like a Bloodborne boss and never get properly punished for it. The 1 healing flask could have been implemented to stop players from getting the victory with less than ideal means. If it is the latter, then it's easy to call their attempt a failure. If it's the former, which I'm much more keen on thinking it is, then in a way, FromSoft has lost some respect for me. The other possible reason is they've prioritized player progression above all else. You gotta have RPG elements like prayer beads, boss memories, gourd seeds, and skill upgrades, right? I'm so tired of seeing RPG leveling systems, and for a game like Sekiro, with such an emphasis on tight combat, it's not even necessary. On the topic of the early game mini-bosses, I was going to talk about the Chained Ogre and the Drunkard specifically. However, at the very least, the Drunkard somewhat encourages stealth, and the Chained Ogre is the first enemy that clearly encourages the experimentation of a shinobi tool. For me, the least comprehensible early enemy is the Flaming Bull. This is a mandatory fight the player has to do if they want to enter Ashina Castle, meaning the player needs to kill him to do anything else in the game other than Hirata Estate. This is right after the first boss of the game, Gyobu Oniwa. FromSoft thought, before opening up the map some more, the player needs to be tested once more with the most aggressive enemy in the game, one that doesn't even work well with parrying and blocking. With how early the player comes across this enemy, and how much it gates off the rest of the game, this encounter really should have been replaced with something that would test the players on parrying. Regardless of how annoying I find him to fight, the bull enemy itself isn't inherently bad. It is a unique encounter that is worthwhile, but the placement doesn't make any sense. As a contrast, there's a different type of bull much later on in the game, and that feels much more fair since the player has been acclimated to the game's mechanics at that point. They'll have much more healing at their disposal, their vitality will be much higher, and they can easily run away if they need to. Why wouldn't these be reversed? An optional early challenge for newer players to try their luck, and a required battle with him for much later on. Setting aside the vulnerabilities to fire and firecrackers for the Chained Ogre and Bull respectively, both are much easier if you decide to dodge and get behind them like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, and since neither work well with parrying, both of these early enemies are encouraging the wrong strategies out of newer players. Again, these enemies aren't terribly designed or anything, but they don't put a spotlight on the game's core mechanics, which is what this game needed more of early on. General Tenzin Yamayuchi, a sword-wielding mini-boss right before the player enters the Serpent Valley, is placed in the middle of a group of enemies, meaning you'll need to clear them all out to fight him every single time, which is tedious at best. There's also the 7 Ashina Spears mini-boss in the Ashina Reservoir, and the amount of enemies you'll need to meticulously take down to have a proper one-on-one duel is staggering. It's not fun at all having to do this rigmarole every time you want to fight a difficult enemy. The only early game mini-boss that is well considered is General Naomori Kawarada. His moveset is very generous once you get the hang of it. He teaches the red perilous attacks that either require jumping or dodging, there aren't any enemies near him at all, and he's very close to a checkpoint idol. The early game should have had many more of these types of mini-bosses. I could see a player genuinely learning how to play the game with opponents such as him. The limited healing and punishing mini-boss fights in the early game make me think FromSoft is taking their fans' perception of them too seriously. Dark Souls, of course, developed this badge of honor, prepare to die, get good culture surrounding it, and it only got worse as the series went on. Initially, Miyazaki mentioned that difficulty wasn't solely the point of his games, but given the Bloodborne DLC, Dark Souls 3, and now Sekiro, I have to feel his mindset has been swayed at least a little bit. Sekiro places such an importance on the player dying early on that everything I just mentioned seems like it was done on purpose, to assure themselves that they've managed to kill even the best players out there at least once. After all, the resurrection dialogue needs to happen since it's so vital to the plot. The first death that spreads the dragon rod is such a big deal that you won't even respawn at your last checkpoint idol. You'll get a cutscene with the sculptor back at the temple instead. Maybe this too was a reason they placed so many idols in the early game, so the player could warp right back to where they died. FromSoft is taking the badge of honor mentality too seriously with their relentless goal of killing new players, and it really bugs me that the community can't see that. Even playing again on a brand new save file, after having already defeated the Demon of Hatred, Genichiro Ishin, and Emma Ishin on 2 separate playthroughs, one being New Game Plus, the early game still felt more irritating than some of the most difficult sections of the late game. The Chained Ogre is still far easier if you get behind him like Bloodborne, Gyobu Oniwa still isn't a great boss, and asking players to defeat him with 3 healing flasks seems misguided, the Flaming Bull is still a terribly considered enemy encounter, and the Swordsman in the Well is one of the worst placed enemies out of all of the last 6 FromSoft games. I feel this way so strongly that after playing the game twice to see 2 of the 4 endings, I couldn't bring myself to drudge my way through some of the early game moments yet again to get a 3rd playthrough finished. This is why I unfortunately won't be talking about the final Owl boss fight. After 2 playthroughs and more than enough time to get a grasp of the mechanics, I still think the opening hours of the game are absolutely terrible. Once you get the hang of the new combat, upgrade your healing a bit more, and open up a few more areas, the game starts to turn into something great, so it's a shame that there are players who may have enjoyed what the game becomes that will put it down once they see how bad the first few hours are. If there's anyone watching who gave up with the game who genuinely wanted to like it, I was in the same boat as you. The game does get better, you just have to push through some very unfun hours. Even though the world has some excellent secrets to discover, the NPC quest lines are interesting enough to seek out when you find them, and the story and lore are more interesting than they first appear, the combat of the game has the most staying power. There's less room to create your own playstyle when it comes to boss fights as in previous games, but the playstyle the game asks of players is very tight once you're used to it. I'm happy that FromSoft have finally taken the plunge and added the boss rush mode, since even though there are less of them overall, the bosses in the game are all pretty good. Before I go more in depth with some of the boss fights, I'll speak about the combat in a more general sense first. In case you've made it this far and haven't played Sekiro before, I'll explain the fundamentals. Combat in Sekiro is built around staying aggressive, avoiding damage, parrying every incoming attack first and foremost, and managing your posture bar. In Bloodborne, staying aggressive was a strategy that mostly involved damage rushing while reading telegraphed attacks and dodging when necessary. In Sekiro, besides a few special case boss fights, it's mostly about overloading the enemy's posture bar. Once it's overloaded, you perform a death blow to wipe an entire health bar away. When first learning a boss's moveset, it's important to know that it's virtually impossible to ignore defense and damage rush them to death. Learning the parry timings not only protects you from vitality damage, protects you from posture damage, but deals posture damage to the enemy. Blocking will protect you from damage on most incoming attacks, but what you protect in vitality you'll sacrifice in posture. Once your posture bar gets overloaded, you're now open for an easy attack from the opponent. All of this creates this really interesting flow of combat where, when you really have the hang of it, you'll be parrying every attack, dodging when necessary, attacking when you can, and if it all goes well enough, the battle can be over within a minute or so. That's the goal, make the encounter last the least amount of time. Depending on the enemy, their posture bar will return to normal if you don't stay aggressive enough, which is why it's heavily encouraged to make the battle short and sweet. Since parrying is such a focus of the game, the fact that it's so clear when the player successfully parries is great. There's a clunk noise when you block an attack, but when you parry an attack, there's a higher pitched clanging noise. If you notice, on the visual side, parrying correctly also produces sparks, while blocking doesn't. Another indicator for you to go on. Even though I like it on the whole, the combat has a few quirks that wore on me as time went on. I understand being staggered when your posture bar gets overloaded, but I really dislike the stagger and down states that Wolf occupies when he's damaged in a certain way. It just seems wrong that getting hit by your opponent not only deals vitality and posture damage, but can stun you as well, leading to more vitality damage. The camera system is unfortunately exactly the same as it has been in all of the previous FromSoft games, which incidentally might make it worse for Sekiro given how easily the player can die when they have their guard down. On more than a handful of occasions, the camera was clearly in a terrible position when in combat, but since the game didn't lift a finger to fix the situation, I would sometimes unlock my camera so I could manually move it into a better position. I feel like by now they should really have an understanding of how poorly done their camera system is in tight spots, which makes the fact that they put enemies into obtuse locations on purpose even worse. The swordsman in the well that Wolf was in the beginning of the game is just ridiculously bad. Why on earth would they think that was a good place to have a duel with a tough opponent? Similar camera issues happen in the double ape fight, since when you're pushed up against a wall, you lose all sight of Wolf. There's never really a clear solution when this happens either. Spamming the dodge and jump buttons is risky, but holding your defenses means destroying your posture all because you can't see what's going on. Even though I love the true monk fight on the bridge, the tree branches caused the camera to spaz out a few times as well. I really hope, whatever Elden Ring turns out to be, this is something that finally sees some attention. The grab attacks are another annoyance that has been carried over. It seems in every FromSoft game they give the enemies way too much leeway with their range. It's bad enough that plenty of the enemies in the game track the player a ridiculous amount when their grab animation plays. Warping the player into their grab even though it looks like they're far enough away is inexcusable. I mentioned how poorly executed some of the early mini-boss encounters were, but there are more as the game goes on. Right before the end boss fight with Genichiro and Ishin, there's two mini-bosses that the player has encountered before, and they team up to fight the player at the same time. Thankfully you aren't completely trapped here, you can run off to the side and leave them be. No idea why FromSoft would think two enemies at once would work well with Sekiro's core mechanics. There's the sorcerer near the waterfall in the Fountainhead area that seems like it was placed in a restricted, confined location just for added difficulty. Having a tough swordsman placed right before either the owl fight or the Emma Ishin fight, depending on the player's decision, is just aggravating. They even have an extra swordsman in the room, so of course when you go in there, you're trapped, and now you have two enemies to fight. This is just genuinely terrible, and it's only salvaged by the fact that you can use your puppeteer ability on the extra guy to make it a little more fair. It isn't all bad though, there are some mini-bosses that are genuinely great. Orin of the Water is placed directly in front of the corrupted monk, which is a good consideration. Her moveset flows like a dance routine, which is something that feels unique to her and the corrupted monk, so it's a good training exercise before the real thing. She seems to know when you're healing and will punish more often than not, and she plays a trick on players who aren't paying close enough attention. She does a lot more posture damage than most enemies the players have faced so far, which means you may die deceptively quickly. This has to do with her apparition status, which means Divine Confetti works well against her, again, which is good since Divine Confetti works well with the corrupted monk just ahead. When you arrive in the abandoned dungeon, there's a sorcerer that is conjuring up some type of terror-inducing magic. Terror in Sekiro is a status much like Insanity in Bloodborne. Once the terror bar fills up, you die no matter what your health is. It's extremely harsh. This mini-boss, however, is one of my other favorites, and that's simply due to his design encouraging a different playstyle. Parrying and blocking are worthless against his magic attacks, and dodging isn't much better. Holding down the sprint button, weaving in and out of the line of fire seem to work pretty well. He has obvious tells when he's about to be vulnerable, so running up, slicing him a few times, and running away provided a nice, unique enemy encounter. The most unique of them all probably has to be the Armored Warrior, which is ironic since if this was Dark Souls, he'd look like an amalgamation of every heavy melee build put together. I have a hunch this was Miyazaki being cheeky, intentionally making you fight something you might see in a Souls game. Since the warrior is most likely from a Western country, it would have been interesting if he spoke English, or at least some other Western language. He still sounds Japanese, which is kind of a missed opportunity. Dealing health damage with him is impossible, and even when you get his posture overloaded, it does nothing but stumble him backwards. Since he destroys the walls and ceilings of the bridge, it becomes clear that the goal is to overload his posture close to the edge and push him off of it. This is a really neat idea, but after a while, if you didn't figure it out, he says it out loud. With how little the environment seems to meaningfully interact with combat in other areas of the game, it's a shame there weren't a few more of these types of encounters. Even though it's meant to be a quick death for new players, the first Genichiro fight can be a proper boss battle on a second playthrough. Since you don't have access to healing items initially, and have severely reduced health and posture, I doubt many people defeated him their first go-around. There's a slightly altered cutscene if the player wins, where one of his goons throws a shuriken that distracts Wolf, leading to his arm being chopped off, of course. Gyobu Oniwa is a perfect example of why you shouldn't play this game with the English audio.
My name is Gyobu Masataka Oniwa!
His opening line is hilarious when it probably wasn't meant to be. Moving past that, on a visual level, this boss arena is my favorite of the game. This area is littered with corpses, showing the remains of a brutal wartime battle. It's a really good setting, and it makes sense to put a boss in the area as the centerpiece. This, unfortunately, is definitely one of the weaker boss fights in the game. Even when you're in complete control of the battle, it always feels like you're on the back foot. Staying aggressive essentially means attacking the horse as often as possible and deflecting the spear attacks, but he doesn't react much to your aggressiveness. He seems to keep trotting along his refined path. It also seems incredibly incongruent that most of the time Wolf's sword connects with the horse instead of Oniwa, but his health bar and posture still take damage. The lock-on creates issues with how it targets Oniwa instead of the horse, meaning if he gets too close, the camera will angle upwards, potentially completely messing a player up. Once you take out the second health bar, the killing animation is absolutely brutal. Nothing fancy, just stabbing him off his horse. As much as I think this is a mostly forgettable boss, this is one of the more enjoyable killing blows in the entire game. Afterwards, the horse just stands there as it vanishes. Like I said, you've been attacking the horse basically the whole time, so this just feels very disconnected. Lady Butterfly is the ending to the Hirata Estate section. The player would never know it on a first playthrough, but this boss and entire section is completely optional. Besides her illusion technique in her second phase, she's pretty straightforward, a nice simple boss that works well with the parrying mechanic. I like that using the shuriken while she's jumping from string to string knocks her down. FromSoft games have this quirk where the consumable items get used up even if you die. This isn't always a bad thing, but given the fact that an NPC before the boss gives you the Snapseed consumable item for you to use to make the fight easier, just seems insulting. You're only going to be able to use it one time, which already isn't enough for one attempt. If the player had used it and died, then that's that. They won't be getting Snapseeds anytime soon, unless they found some in the Serpent Valley. Without the Snapseeds to make the illusions vanish, this fight gets pretty annoying. They all attack at once, and seemingly all use perilous red symbol attacks, which fills your ears with false warnings. When she finally snaps them away, they turn into an unblockable magic attack that you'll need to run around to avoid. Genichiro Ashina is the best sparring partner for the player to learn the core mechanics. The fight is tightly designed around parrying. It's the best duel between two swordsmen the player has seen so far. He's also the first boss that can be slain with what I am now going to call the 2-block method. Anytime you're fighting a humanoid boss with a weapon of some kind, there's a pattern of attack you can fall into that seems to work every time. Parry their attack, attack them so they block you twice in a row, parry their counterattack, attack so they block you twice in a row, and repeat. I say until they block twice, since if I am hitting them and dealing vitality damage, I generally keep swinging until they start blocking again. I do it often in this fight, but you'll also see the same pattern with Emma and Ishin later on. All three of them also have a tendency to read the player inputs when it comes to healing. If you're within a certain range of any of them and try to heal, it will instantly trigger their gap closing attack. He'll use a bow initially, but in the final phase he performs a thrusting attack from across the arena. Sometimes you can take advantage of it, other times you don't get so lucky. Out of everything in this fight, his bow, for me, is the trickiest thing to work around. Since parrying arrows doesn't deal posture damage, he basically gets to attack without risking his posture at all. His second health bar plays out the same way, but he also returns with a third health bar. Lightning gets added to the mix, so you either have to avoid lightning attacks in total, or jump in the air, parry, and fire back at him before touching the ground. There's a banner that hints at this before the fight, so it's pretty fair, and a visually and mechanically interesting way for this fight to end. I have a very strong suspicion hardcore fans of the Souls games will hate the folding screen monkeys, since it's not trying to be a traditional boss fight. There are 3 monkeys on the 4 folding screens when you arrive in this realm. Talking to the NPC up ahead explains what's going on. The color of each monkey determines their gimmick. One can see but can't hear, one can hear but can't see, and one has low perception of both sight and sound, but alerts the others when it spots you. In motion, this boss fight essentially consists of chasing down the monkeys individually and taking them out one at a time. The arena has certain gimmicked areas that will help you take out specific monkeys. For example, there's a room that has a waterfall in it that will drown out all other noise. There's also a room that has a door in it which, when opened, can blow out the candles, making it harder to see Wolf. Once you kill your first monkey, a couple of apparitions come back to chase after you as you go. Only the real monkeys deal damage to the boss's health bar though, so killing them won't do much. After killing 3 of the real monkeys, the fight isn't over. I had suspicions that the amount of damage per monkey wasn't going to take down the full health bar, but figuring out the reason for it was a fun surprise. There's a 4th monkey. While I was chasing all 3 down, I could hear constant monkey noises seemingly coming from right behind me, but I just chalked it up to the area having bad sound balancing. It was the invisible monkey chasing after me as I went. The blank screen in the intro cutscene perfectly telegraphed this, but it's not something I thought of immediately. I initially couldn't get over how terribly designed the Guardian Ape was when I played the game 2 years ago. Thrashing all over the place, never a proper window to attack since he attacks so frequently, and him reviving after you defeat him pissed me off beyond belief. It's a pretty big contrast to how I feel now, as he was one of the highlights of the entire game for me. One of the reasons is how well considered his animations are. He doesn't seem to have any that are purposeless, and he doesn't hold his attacks longer than you think he should, which is something that exists for basically every FromSoft boss at this point. Even his sweeping attack that you need to jump over begins with the same fist pound into the ground every single time. Even though he's the biggest enemy you faced so far, staying on top of him and being aggressive is the best strategy, which is exemplified perfectly after he gets stunned. Seeing a creature 20 times your size run away gives the impression that you're the one in control of the fight. After his posture bar is overloaded, an extremely satisfying death blow takes out his only health bar, beheading him. The text even appears on screen, signifying you've defeated the boss. This is one of the many times the game lies to the player on how long boss fights will go on, but this one compared to the others is better contextualized with the lore of the game and offers a better payoff. The ape then grabs his severed head, grabs the sword that was used to decapitate him, and continues fighting like it's no big deal. The contrast between the 2 phases is very interesting, both visually and from a gameplay perspective. You'd think it would be more advantageous to parry attacks with a sword and dodge attacks from a vicious creature, but for the Guardian Ape, it's the opposite. It's far easier to parry his swipes early on and dodge his extremely exaggerated swings. He also has an area of effect attack that deals terror damage, screaming at you with his severed head. If you don't run away fast enough, it's nearly a guaranteed death. What I love about it is that there's a little sway he does before the attack starts. It even happens before the red danger symbol appears. It gives you plenty of time to read it and run away. The visual language of the Guardian Ape is so well considered, which is why he's my favorite of the bunch. If you've defeated the Guardian Ape, you can fight him again in a different area. This time he begins headless, and in the second phase, a different ape joins the fray. This reminds me of the man-eaters from Demon Souls or the gargoyles from Dark Souls, in the sense that only once the fight is halfway over does the game throw another enemy at you. The core mechanics don't mesh well with multiple enemies as much as the previous games, however, but this is an example of it not being so bad. The corrupted monk in the Mibu area has a lot going for it. Because this isn't the true monk we'll see later on, I won't go too in-depth with the attack patterns, but they are fair and enjoyable to parry. Since this is after Orin of the Water, as I said earlier, it is nice that both of them have that flowy, dance-like quality to them. This illusion of the corrupted monk is defending the door to the entrance to the Fountainhead Palace. Once you get to the entrance later on in the game, his true self is there, defending it even more closely. It just makes perfect sense for his illusion form to be down here, waging war on anyone who even sniffs at the path to the gateway to the Divine Realm. Since he is an illusion, you can use Snap Seeds in this fight to knock off some health. It's a pretty nice consideration. Divine Confetti and Akko's Spiritfall are also good items for this fight, since it's incredibly hard to deal enough posture damage without taking a very large chunk of the monk's health away first. The next boss for the player will be determined by their decision in the story. Wolf's father returns, which is supposed to be a surprise since last we saw him he was supposedly dying in Hirata Estate 3 years ago. However, the player might not have gone to the past with the bell, and the last time they would have seen Owl was in the intro cutscene, so they could be confused. The Owl gives you a choice: stay loyal to Kuro, or stay loyal to your father. I actually didn't think this decision would matter in the slightest on my first playthrough, so I'm extremely thankful I decided to stay loyal to Kuro. Owl, of course, isn't happy Wolf disobeyed him and broke the Iron Code, so a boss fight takes place in the same arena as the Genichiro battle. Great Shinobi Owl is an extremely aggressive boss. I'll talk about her soon, but it's amazing how much he contrasts Emma. Emma or the Owl will be the next boss the player faces to advance in the story, so them being so drastically different makes the two decisions feel even more opposite of each other. He uses shurikens, firecrackers, performs the Makiri counter, and does a jumping backflip off of Wolf during the fight, all of which are really nice touches given that he of course trained Wolf at a young age, and Wolf is able to do all of those things as well at this point. Even though his green shinobi charm takes away your ability to heal yourself, meaning it is very punishing, it looks very silly and seems out of place for him to do randomly in the middle of a combo chain. In his second phase, he throws poison after the backflip, and he has a very large smoke bomb. Overall, I do think this is a solid boss fight, it's just not one that particularly stood out to me. If the player decides to forsake Kuro, Owl isn't the next boss fight. Since Owl is seeking the divine blood like everyone else at this point, Emma is now the last person standing in the way. She only has one health bar, but at this point the player should be expecting anything and everything. The way she walks around the battlefield feels really wrong, like her feet aren't really making contact with the floor or something. Her gait just feels off with how fast she moves. Like in Ichiro, she completely reads your inputs when you're healing. The moment you press up on the D-pad, she begins to close the gap immediately. Because her character model is so tiny, it can be hard to know the difference between the 3 different perilous symbol attacks. She has a grab, a sweep, and a thrust. Before learning her moveset like the back of my hand, her grab animation looked way too similar to the sweeping animation, so I would constantly be jumping on top of her when she was performing a grab, and then I got damaged for it. Even when you do know about it, her range for the grab attack is ridiculous, and she tracks you until the last moment. It's an awful attack, and given that she just gives Wolf a back bump, it's disgusting how much damage it inflicts. Besides that, she's a great example of a boss becoming genuinely fun once you get the hang of it. Like I said before, the 2-block method works with her as well. It's such an effective strategy, I'd have to assume most players figured it out themselves. After you take her out, there's a different boss to fight. Ishin Ashina in his first phase is very similar to how he is in the other ending in the first phase, so for me it wasn't too difficult. I like how in this variation, the first attack you perform in a combo, Ishin will slyly dodge out of the way. He also has a grab attack, and it's just as silly as Emma's. Taking a back bump just shouldn't be as damaging as a slash of a sword, I'm sorry. Once you get the first death blow is where the real struggle begins. His second health bar is, for me, the most difficult singular boss phase in the entire game. Not only is Ishin more aggressive in this round, but he adds fire damage to the mix. Lots of attacks he performs now have an extra layer of fire on them, giving them either more range or a creeping effect from the ground that you'll need to jump to avoid. That's to say nothing of the incredibly frustrating firestorm that occurs when he charges at you. There are areas in the arena where you won't be affected by the fire, but it seems inconsistent where on the ground is safe or not. There were many times I thought I was in the right position, only to be blasted in the ass. Most of his attacks, including the firestorm, double dip on damage, meaning that once you make one mistake, it's likely you'll take damage from his entire combo chain. There's also the burning effect he inflicts on you, which once the meter fills up takes a huge amount of your health. In a vacuum, I do think this is a solid fight. I like that you can still bait out a few of his first phase attacks to relieve some pressure. The idea of him being able to utilize the arena in battle is at least unique for this game, and after you get the hang of them, all of his attack animations are well telegraphed.
Sekiro.
If the player chose to stay loyal to Kuro and defeat the Owl, the next encounter will be the true corrupted monk. Right before that, though, the method that the player is transported to this area is quite interesting. It's like a giant rope. The Corrupted Monk version 2.0 has 3 health bars, but none of them are too different from each other. The multiple health bars are just a way to lengthen the fight, it seems. I understand due to its difficulty and story implications it needed to be this far into the game, but it is a really good training exercise in deflections, one that could have been placed much earlier. There are long combo chains that are uninterruptible and consistent with their timing, which when in motion and parried correctly gives off a very nice visual. The first phase is nearly flawless. My problems begin after the first death blow. At the start and the middle of the second health bar, the monk will perform this trio of ghostly attacks at the player. Attempting to deal with this section dynamically using the tree branches or dodging is very risky. It's far easier to just hold the block button, put your back up against the wall, and wait for it to be over. Maybe I just happen to have the right amount of maximum posture for this to work, but every time I saw this, I became incredibly bored. I imagine using snap seeds during this section would work to cut down on this waste of time, but requiring a consumable item to make an otherwise boring section go by quicker isn't ideal. The third health bar thankfully doesn't have this. Instead, there's an immortal centipede that spits out terror on a few attacks. There's also a great whirlwind attack that gets introduced on this phase as well, which is similarly satisfying to parry. After making it through the Fountainhead Palace, the player enters the Divine Realm and faces the Divine Dragon. This is another gimmicky boss fight that I'm assuming players didn't love, and to an extent I feel the same way, at least for the first half. The player needs to kill all of the small white dragons in this area, and they mostly just spit out poison. Eventually, tree roots spring up from the ground that can deal damage, and other, more aggressive dragon variants spawn in to distract the player. Much like the monkeys, killing these guys won't deplete the boss's health bar. The second phase of this fight is much more enjoyable on a spectacle level. All you really do is easily avoid obvious attacks from the dragon, while grappling to trees that have lightning on them, and then throw the lightning back at the dragon. Visually, it is very appealing, but while it is something different, I don't think it's as interesting as the folding screen monkeys from earlier. One of the only true optional main bosses is the Demon of Hatred. How he connects with the story and lore of the game is really interesting. He's the sculptor, the one who has given you your shinobi prosthetic arm in the beginning. He's turned into a Shura, which apparently for him takes the form of an orangutan. The Shura is a demon that has insatiable bloodlust, destroying anything and everything for seemingly no other motive, and that's what Wolf is presumed to turn into if you honor the Iron Code and defeat Emma and Ishin. Ishin Ashina has dialogue in his fight that implies he's taken down a Shura before, most likely the sculptor. One of the endings to the game shows Wolf becoming a sculptor to repay his karmic debt. Just like the sculptor before him, he's in constant danger of turning into a Shura, and will seemingly provide his prosthetic arm to a new shinobi at some point in the future, possibly to take his life if it ever comes to that. Anyway, back to the fight now. He has 3 health bars, is gigantic, and extremely difficult. He also plays much easier if you abandon the Sekiro ways of parrying and blocking, as dodging and jumping are much more beneficial. The only thing that drags down this fight overall is how poorly done the lock-on camera is. It has the same issue the old hero had all the way back in Demon Souls. It's too high up on his body. Since most of the time you'll be slashing at his legs, it's better to unlock the camera for most of the fight. As daunting as he is on the outset, his attacks are all well considered and varied. It's important to stay on top of him at all times throughout the fight, so his fireball attacks to ward off sprinting players feels believable, as if he's trying to keep you away. Running to the side and jumping is a good way to avoid his fire floor attack, and running back and forth is a good way to stay safe from his floating fireballs. The third phase is the only one where it's smart to stay far away, as he creates a ring of fire that will trap you, and does a spinning attack that has a very big range. With how fast he moves on the battlefield, it feels like you're constantly in motion, always moving with a purpose. If you're up close, you're dodging his stomps and hand swipes. If you're far away, you're sprinting to the side and jumping over his fire floor attack. If you're in between, you're baiting his fireballs or grappling at him to close the distance. It's a real treat, and something that's perfect for near the end of the game as an optional boss fight. The final boss of the game, if the player chose to stay loyal to Kuro and not go down the purification ending, which gives them a different version with the owl fight, is Genichiro again. Personally, regardless of how interesting the other endings and bosses are, finishing the game with the Genichiro fight in the same location you fought him in the beginning is extremely fitting. It gives the impression that we've come full circle, so much so that I'd imagine this was the first thing FromSoft had in mind when devising an ending to this story. This version of Genichiro has 1 health bar, and the only thing he's added to his bag of tricks is the Mortal Blade attack, which is easy to avoid if you happen to fight him, 50 times or so. Much like Emma from before, he's the bouncer for the real final boss, Ishin. Yes, Ishin, but a younger version. I'll be honest, I don't understand the implications of how this worked out in the story. Once you've finally shaken off the disturbing visual, you might notice he has 3 health bars, meaning this entire final boss sequence has 4 phases. Anyway, Ishin's first fight is one of my favorites. It's hard to pinpoint why, Maybe it has to do with learning his moveset over the course of a couple of hours. The 2-block method works well on him, of course, and even though there are lots of attacks that you can't deflect, you can easily read when they're about to happen, and find a good strategy to get around them. What's more, his demeanor is calm and reserved for the most part, which suits the flowery beauty of the battlefield really well. After a death blow, he usually immediately grabs his spear that apparently he's been hiding underground, but sometimes he keeps attacking, which can be very punishing if you had used that time to heal. This is where we see a completely new moveset, mostly involving his new spear, but there's even a few attacks where he shoots you with a gun. I think this is how far the fight should have gone, or skip this one entirely and replace it with the last phase. 4 phases, 2 different bosses, 3 different movesets to learn. It just seems like a bit much. This is exacerbated by the arena itself. It is very pretty to look at, but the flowery terrain makes certain attacks much harder to read. It's best to run to the ditch without flowers, since you'll have a better time seeing his legs and even his spear when he's doing certain attacks. Once his second health bar gets depleted, it's on to the lightning round. Including the lightning strikes again in the last moments of the game was a nice thematic decision. It makes the encounter that much more grandiose, and his moveset brings him closer to his grandson. It is a shame how the lightning can be blocked by the environment though. One time it hit the tree, and one time it just seemed to hit the elevated ground. Not a very good feeling when your adrenaline is going. Dealing the last death blow got me to scream very loudly in excitement, so even though I think 4 phases is too much, it obviously got the reaction out of me that they were going for. All things considered, speaking on the multi-boss final boss fights, in isolation, I don't think there's a particularly weak one in the bunch. Besides the floor is lava section in the Ishin Ashina fight, and the flowery terrain blocking your view in the Saint Ishin fight, there's nothing bad about any of them. When you combine unrelated bosses together, forcing players to fight the first one many times to see the real finale, it wears on you in a way that can be very unappealing. Like I said, FromSoft were obviously intending it that way, so it isn't a failure, it's just something to consider. If you view it as a way to subvert players' expectations and provide a unique twist, there were way too many in this game for that to work. Lady Butterfly, Genichiro, Guardian Ape, Headless Ape, Ishin Ashina, and Ishin Sword Saint all made similar attempts to either hide their full health bar or hide all of the bosses within them. The Guardian Ape's revival was by far and away the best executed. If anything, all of the other bosses that hid their full health bar made it less special. Given how much you've heard me say the word phase or health bars in this video now, it should be clear that FromSoft has a multiple phase addiction for their boss fights. They need to snap out of this, since it's beyond formulaic. The folding screen monkeys are a great change of pace no matter how you slice it, but it's kind of absurd that the first Corrupted Monk fight was also one of the biggest surprises, because it lacked multiple phases. If anything, this shift just goes to show that I'm probably on the money, where FromSoft is more concerned about making their games more difficult. The second Genichiro phase doesn't provide any meaningful changes, and the second Ishin Sword Saint doesn't do anything that wasn't present in the third and final phase. The true Corrupted Monk probably didn't need to be 3 health bars either. If they had kept the 3 health bars gimmick solely for the Demon of Hatred, that would have made it even more unique than it already is. As far as the story goes, it's not bad, and it stays out of the way for most of the experience, which is good. Kuro's English voice actor makes it a little harder to stay interested, but the Japanese audio with subtitles is fine. In terms of progression, I've already gone through why it's disappointing that there are limited areas to explore right away. However, I think a bigger problem is the decision to keep Hirata Estate optional. I would have liked it if that was just the first level, akin to Demon Souls where Boletaria was the first level. Since it is in the past, and the Carp Guy and other items are there as well, you would need to be able to warp back, but that really wouldn't be that different than how it is now, since you can still teleport there as often as you'd like. If you made the Drunkard fight a bit easier, then I feel this would be a fine first area of the game, and it would assure that players get a small amount of the backstory and understanding of this infamous knight before other characters allude to it. It would also provide a better first boss, as Lady Butterfly, without her illusion technique, is a better test of parrying and blocking than Oniwa, in my opinion. I just think if you're going to already heavily restrict the player in the beginning anyway, at least make some use of it and let the story chronologically play out. Besides seeing Wolf's arm chopped off, I have no idea what is gained by starting the game how it does now. Letting the player return to the past within the first half hour means they could basically experience that section before all the others anyway. The only thing they'd know for sure about is Kuro being captured. If you're going to do things out of chronological order, I would hope there would be a reason for it. Since the player needs to get a different bell to see the secret owl fight, it's not like these two are tied together, and if anything, having the old Hirata estate be the first thing the player needs to go through would make the secret Hirata estate with the owl that much more significant. I'm also unsure on why Wolf loses his will to go on, deciding to chill out in the well at the beginning. It takes Emma dropping a note card telling him to rescue Kuro for him to start giving a shit. It's not like Kuro being captured was going to send Wolf into a depression. Wolf still sets out to save Kuro after he's captured a few minutes later, even though Wolf gets his arm chopped off. Maybe I'm missing something, but it just seems like a contrivance for the sake of it. The resurrection mechanic works well with the story. Essentially, Wolf has been granted the power to come back after death, an honor given to those who serve the divine heir, apparently. My problem is that checkpoints still function exactly the same way as they did in the previous games. If the player dies for real and respawns at the sculptor idol, the items that were used are all still gone, and if the player has killed any mini-bosses that don't revive, they are still dead as well. You aren't being reverted back in time when you were alive to try again. The game acknowledges the events that transpired. What looked like an attempt to diegetically contextualize respawning at a checkpoint is instead a buffer that just gives you a half a health bar when you die. Resurrecting seemingly only functions as a gameplay mechanic, but even then it falls short. Choosing to die instead of resurrect doesn't prevent the dragon rot from spreading or the unseen aid to diminish. The only reason you might choose not to resurrect on death is if you had more than one resurrection charged up, but using the second one would be wasteful since you don't have a grasp on a boss's moveset or something, and even then it's not as useful since you can't resurrect twice in the same boss phase. The game places more importance on respawning at the idol after dying instead of resurrecting, which seems completely pointless and defeats the purpose of the lore and the story having it in the first place. Why place so much importance on the dragon's blood, the divine heir, and resurrection if that's not the thing that spreads a horrible disease when abused? It's a complete missed opportunity. If the dragon rot spread was changed to align with how often the player used the resurrect option, this would make the player have to choose. They could resurrect, which could help them in the short term for a combat encounter, or they could die, protecting the NPCs from dragon rot. It's by no means perfect, but now there's at least a reason to choose death instead of resurrection. As it is now, if you're truly hellbent on not spreading dragon rot at all, and not in a boss fight, it's better to just resurrect than run back to a checkpoint and rest. Similarly, this could have been avoided by just not allowing players the option to die, forcing them to resurrect once per life no matter what. Since there's no meaningful decision to be made, I'm left to wonder what the purpose of it all is. Besides that, everything else with the story and lore is pretty solid. The amount of endings is surprising, and they all have meaningful rewards for players who want to see them all. I especially can't believe there's an ending to relocate the Divine Dragon. The NPC storylines are also interesting, I just don't have much to say about them. The Carp, the Windmill, the Doctor, and Black Hat Badger were all questlines that either surprised me with their longevity and uniqueness, or the amount of different ways they could go. My only complaint with NPCs in general is how most of them don't appear different enough from regular enemies. Black Hat Badger looks exactly the same as the other rats, which caused me to attack him, and while yes, the guy looking in the well doesn't look to be in a position to fight, there have been other enemies in compromised positions as well, such as the Grieving Horsemaster. As a player, it became unclear which NPCs I was supposed to heinously slaughter without question, and which ones were worth talking to. I murdered so many old ladies from behind without even thinking, but when Wolf meets Tengu, he puts his sword away, even though the dialogue at first makes it sound like he's about to attack you. Certain NPCs cause Wolf to put his sword away, some NPCs can be attacked and killed, and others your sword glides right through them. It all seems so inconsistent and arbitrary. Inconsistent and arbitrary are good descriptors for a lot of Sekiro. The resurrection mechanic doesn't fit in with the story as much as they clearly wanted it to. Enemies seem haphazardly placed in areas just for the sake of difficulty. Players begin with limited healing and limited areas to explore, forcing them into needlessly brutal enemy encounters. The frequent checkpoint idols and lack of a better world design mean you'll be fast traveling every step of the way. The grappling hook only works in very specific locations, even though the level design makes it look like that shouldn't be the case, and the stealth in general seems to be hit or miss depending on the player's level and the enemy design. That being said, it is hard to deny how good the game is at its best. The first vista of Fountainhead Palace, the Great Colored Carp, the Giant Serpent, the Guardian Ape, Demon of Hatred, Corrupted Monk, Ishin Ashina, and Ishin the Sword Saint are all moments I won't soon forget. Even though it doesn't quite meet expectations of being as good as FromSoft's earlier games, and doesn't feel different enough to truly separate itself from what we expect a FromSoft game to be, it's still a pretty good game. That being said, when I think about playing the first few hours of the game again, if given the option, I'll choose not to resurrect next time.